In this news roundup of the week for 22nd of July 2022, Joe Biden nearly declares a climate emergency. Would it be a move too far for America's fragile situation? The two final candidates for UK Prime Minister are settled, but whether they like net zero or not, their options are limited. The European Commission instructs EU member states to cut gas use. Most of them are fighting back. And in this week's Short Thought, I talk about the value of admitting when you were wrong. My name is Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. US President Joe Biden caught COVID this week. He's of course right in the demographic that can have the worst time with COVID, although hopefully the combination of vaccination, Omicron's reduced lethality, and the fact that, like Trump before him, he will have the very best healthcare that the United States can offer. We trust that all of that means that he comes through. I was not impressed by left-wing Democrats who celebrated unvaccinated Republicans catching COVID last year, some of whom died. I am equally unimpressed by those Republicans now celebrating Biden catching COVID. There are times when you can leave the point scoring to one side, you would think, but not when you're in a civil war, apparently. A theme we will return to. Anyway, presuming his health issues don't go seriously southwards, catching COVID was a long way from the worst thing that has been happening to Biden recently. Chief amongst them was the final sinking by Senator Joe Manchin of his big spending, ambitious climate agenda. After months of torturous negotiations to try to get something that Manchin would accept, finally Manchin just threw in the towel and said that he wasn't playing. This came after the Supreme Court had blocked the ability of the executive to push measures to agencies such as the EPA that significantly exceeded what Congress had explicitly delegated to them. And that effectively stalls any chance of a legislative programme to address climate change for the time being. Now, were America not in a civil war mindset, maybe it would be the prompt to find a middle path. Something both sides could support. Right now, just not how it works. That is now leading some Democrat lawmakers to see that the only way forward is to grab the prize anyway. So Democratic Senator Sheldon Whitehouse said this: "With legislative options now closed, the president must act. It's time for executive beast mode." Really? You have to wonder what a 79-year-old Biden in beast mode might actually look like. I'm guessing that you wouldn't intuitively expect this would be something you would find overly scary. The principle was that if the president declared that there was a climate emergency under the National Emergency Act, then he could use those emergency powers that would not normally be available. This week we had a speech from Biden on climate where a number of people thought that this would be the moment he was going to declare such an emergency. In the event, he kind of talked around it, muttered darkly that it would probably happen sometime soon, could happen. Since Congress is not acting as it should, this is an emergency and I will look at it that way. As president, I'll use my executive powers to combat the climate crisis in the absence of executive action. But he didn't announce a climate emergency. What he did announce were a couple of relatively restrained non-emergency initiatives, including providing $2.3 billion in funding for a programme expanding flood control and retrofitting buildings, as well as leveraging funding to help low-income families cover heating and cooling costs. And to drive home his usual slogan, "When I think of climate, I think of jobs," he announced the moves at a former coal power plant, which is due to be turned into a cable manufacturing facility to support the offshore wind industry. But forget all that, focus back on that emergency declaration that could be looming, driven by the understandable frustration of being blocked at every turn. While Biden beast mode might not feel scary, I would argue this is a moment not to be underestimated, because it is, on its face, deeply unconstitutional for the executive to just declare an emergency in order to be able to exercise extraordinary powers and get around a block in the Senate. People often say delusional things about what they purport the founding fathers did or didn't want to achieve with the Constitution, but one thing that is beyond question was that what it was trying to solve was, when human beings are flawed and prone to corruption, how do you prevent tyranny? This was a time when the idea of democracy was an experiment that many people thought must fail, and a company that was removing itself from tyrannical rule of a faraway monarch. We have seen in more recent history how autocratic rulers regularly declare the existence of an outside threat, an emergency, in order to secure more powers and compliance. And whatever precedent one side sets for purposes that it may feel are justifiable, you can expect the other side to use it in turn for reasons that you may not feel are so justifiable. I have said several times now that I consider the US to be in an undeclared civil war, which may or may not end up in actual fighting. Such things can be fought by other means, but it will only end when there is a new constitutional settlement that will either deliver an amended process of government that can function, but that both sides will support, or an agreement on the division of the country. Neither of those will come before both sides have exhausted themselves in conflicts of some sort. It turned out in the last day or so that opinion is actually now in the majority in the US itself. A new poll from the University of California found that 50.1% of US citizens now agree that to some extent a civil war will happen soon. 47.8% disagreed. You might expect that steps on the path to that process would include breaking the current system. That was visible when Trump refused to accept the result of the 2020 election. It'll continue if the next election equally has at least one side, possibly both sides, in the same mindset. The refusal to accept 2024 result could end up being the turning point, or the breakdown could limp on for decades, as it did with the first Civil War, before it finally arrived in full force. But in my view, the executive branch invoking emergency powers to force action could be another step in the disintegration of norms. It isn't owned by just one side, it's just how these systems degrade and fall apart. Arguably, you could see the executive overreach during the Obama presidency, where he rewrote immigration reform law because Congress wouldn't, on the same "if Congress won't act, then I will" principle. Now that was thrown out by the Supreme Court. Trump then followed the lead, declaring the emergency at the border to shift funding towards building the wall. But the step Biden could be taking would push the principle a lot further, which is what eventually happens with all of these sorts of precedents. The version of net zero climate action championed by the AOC Democrats that has so much influence with the administration is one of using the issue to shoehorn in a lot of socialist policies. One reason why the whole concept of net zero is controversial amongst those people who can't tell the difference between a policy objective net zero and the policies to achieve it. So a Biden emergency declaration on climate would necessarily be far more extensive for a far longer period and with far more politically controversial measures than anything that came before. I mean, maybe not. Maybe it would be invoked, some big but largely symbolic thing would be pushed through, and then that would be it for now, until the next time. But probably it would go further. The temptation will be, if you're going to do it, use it as the opportunity to do all of the things that you've been blocked from doing. People who care about climate change in the US are just looking for whatever they think might work, but without much awareness that I can see of the far-reaching consequences they're likely to invoke. Now, maybe those consequences are things the US has to go through in order to come out the other side. Some people might think that. I'm just an observer on this, not a campaigner. I do hope that it manages to find a way to come through to the other side with an outcome that's long-term the best for its people and for the world, whatever that looks like. Now, in the UK, the implementation, or not, of net zero targeted policies promises to be less consequential. But even so, it got a bigger focus this week as the Supreme Court here ordered the government to detail how its policies would actually achieve net zero. The move came from a lawsuit of environmental campaign groups using the fact that the Climate Change Act 2008 makes climate targets mandatory. The groups argued that the government's announced net zero strategy was too vaguely defined to be able to show that it would in fact be sufficient to meet its own stated targets. Now this comes at an interesting moment because, as we'll discuss in a minute, we will soon be seeing a new Prime Minister. And whichever candidate it is, they are likely to want to take a revised approach to net zero policies, particularly seeking versions that don't disadvantage people facing this cost of living crisis and the energy crisis. But although some people in the Conservative Party would love them to simply announce they're going to throw the whole lot out, that is not likely possible, even should the candidate want to. The UK commitment on climate change is written into legislation, hence the court case. Now the government could theoretically pass new legislation to abolish it, except they almost certainly could not get it through the House of Commons. None of the opposition would vote for that, and a strong majority of the Conservative Party support the net zero goal as well and feel strongly enough about it that it would certainly see a sizable rebellion. So the new Prime Minister will come in with an order from the court to sort out the detail of what they're going to do, without the option to decide that the answer to that is anything short of achieving net zero. You could take that as an ironic contrast. Joe Biden can only push net zero by indulging executive overreach. The new UK Prime Minister could only avoid pushing net zero through, executive overreach. By the way, there's no evidence that either of the candidates wants to get rid of it. They're certainly downplaying it in the contest, but that's largely because amongst the Conservative membership, it's not seen as a priority issue. They are focusing on the ones that are. Net zero at the expense of making the cost of living crisis worse, obviously not seen as a good thing, but that puts the pressure on for better policies, not necessarily no policies. That's how it seems right now. We shall see how it plays out. Moving on to the leadership election more generally, the selection of the next Prime Minister proceeded pretty much as I flagged last week, in that the candidates most popular with the membership, Kemi Badenoch, Penny Mordaunt, they were successfully kept by the members of Parliament away from the wider vote of members in favour of the two that suited them best politically. I'm not saying they were right, I'm not saying they were wrong to do that. People follow the incentives in front of them, but certainly a number of party members felt cheated of their ability to vote for who they wanted. And that's not even counting those who demanded that the deposed leader Boris Johnson should also be on the ballot, which is not possible. The two left, Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer and the current Foreign Secretary respectively, will now have a couple of months of campaigning and hustings around the country before the vote takes place in September. Although Sunak was the one who attracted the higher support from members of Parliament at all stages of the contest, he is by far the underdog when it comes to the final vote of the membership. Whether fairly or not, he is viewed as having increased taxes, which is something of a no-no for Conservatives. He argues with some justice that he only did so because the country had an unexpected pandemic where, to significant acclaim at the time, he had spent hundreds of billions of pounds supporting people and businesses, getting medical equipment and PPE, developing vaccines on a hugely accelerated time frame. Those bitter political realities. Yeah, Rishi Sunak was so popular when he was basically handing out stonking great wadges of cash to everyone. Not so popular when the bills need to be paid. His opponent, Liz Truss, swears that it's still easy. You just turn it into longer-term borrowing, not shorter-term. And that means you can cut taxes now, not raise them. Conservatives who are supposed to believe in sound finance, i.e. you don't spend what you can't afford, have ended up somewhat confused as a result of this discussion. Sunak argues he's the true heir to Margaret Thatcher, the champion of tax cutting and the smaller state, because after all she only cut taxes when it had been made possible by government prudence. It's worth noting that although Thatcher successfully cut income tax rates, nevertheless the overall tax burden only declined 0.7% under her tenure. Which still, in a modern society where people want government to do more and more, placed her in the top 5 of tax-cutting prime ministers. with all of the others amongst her predecessors, none of them amongst her successors. Thanks to inheriting a tax burden that had gotten bigger under the previous 4 incumbents, Blair, Brown, Cameron and May, plus the pandemic and by all accounts his own natural tendencies, Boris Johnson has presided over the second highest tax burden of any Prime Minister, second only to that of the post-war Labour government of Clement Attlee. Rishi Sunak, as his Chancellor, now very much taking the blame for that. His argument is it would have been even worse but for him. One of those impossible propositions to prove. Now, the opposition Labour Party is licking their lips because they see either of these candidates, and particularly the favourite to win, Liz Truss, as being eminently beatable in a general election. I mean, it would be better if they themselves had a more charismatic, exciting and weighty candidate, but, they have what they have. By the time the election comes in 2 years, the new Prime Minister will have had to deal with some of the most difficult issues facing the country, an energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, and, of course, the Ukraine war. Lots of scope for making early missteps. And speaking of all those rather important issues, the big question we were pondering last week, would Russia turn the gas back on after the maintenance to the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, has been answered in the affirmative. Gazprom resumed gas shipments this week, having tormented its customers a few days earlier with comments about how it could stop deliveries due to force majeure, events that were out of its control. At the point of making this video, the flow of gas was still significantly below capacity, about 30%. You'll recall that before the pipeline was temporarily closed, Russia had already cut the volumes to around 40% of capacity. Putin said earlier this week that 40% was about the level that it would return to. Earlier in the week, the EU had readied itself for all the possible outcomes by announcing that its member countries should aim to reduce their gas consumption by 15% to support the move to store gas up in preparation for winter. Obviously, if the gas flow had remained at zero, that would have had a much more immediate relevance. The EU still described a total shut-off as a likely scenario at some point and said that should that happen, the 15% reduction would become compulsory. Compulsory! Now that seems a fairly startling step from the EU, since it's not actually, a federal government. That's how it seemed to a number of member states as well, unsurprisingly. Germany, France, Poland, Ireland and the Netherlands all raised concerns over the targets and the Commission's ability to trigger a mandatory requirement without a vote. Spain and Portugal rejected the idea outright. Apparently the critics were calling it Commission creep, which is a neat way of putting it, and one other way, I might argue, of saying executive overreach. Meanwhile, it was announced just earlier today that Belgium, in exactly the way that Germany isn't, has announced that it's extending the life of 2 of its nuclear power plants. They would have shut in 2025, but now the plan is to keep them going, if possible, for a further 10 years. Nuclear power accounts for just over half the country's electricity. Meanwhile, with the actual war, Russia has declared that it is expanding the amount of Ukrainian territory that it's looking to take over and to absorb. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov told Russian state media it is far from being only DPR, Donetsk People's Republic, and LPR, Luhansk People's Republic. It is also Kherson region, Zaporizhzhia region, and a number of other territories. And this process continues. It continues steadily and persistently. He blamed the West supplying Ukraine with long-range weaponry for the change, saying that the extra land grab was to keep any such weapons far enough away from the Russian border. These new goals may be something you can take at face value, that Russia aims to seize all that territory and it's confident that it can do so, but you can take very few things at face value in this current situation. You could instead read this statement as seeking to create the circumstances where Ukraine would be incentivized to concede Russian takeover of Donetsk and Luhansk. If they were offered a deal on that, Or in the absence of a deal, they were persuaded that Russia would just take more, but it would potentially give them the incentive to deal. Concede the smaller part so as not to lose the larger part. After all, for Russia, the most stable outcome from this, since Ukraine didn't just crumble and capitulate, is a negotiated settlement. If they simply take over a territory and then seek to defend it, the war doesn't end. The territory is never officially recognised as part of Russia by anyone but them. Now, for that to work, they have to be able to persuade Ukraine and the world that they will succeed eventually in their larger objectives, and therefore negotiating will become the least worst option. Now, of course, if they actually did look like they could succeed on the larger aims, that creates a momentum of its own. Voices within the region will be saying that the goal should be expanded even further as a result, and so on and so on. Possibility which may be used itself to put time pressure on the Ukrainians. Right now, Ukraine is reporting a degree of improved success thanks to its receipt of British and American more accurate long-range weaponry. So the question of whether Russia's expectations are going to be borne out in practice remains to be seen. In the meantime, they are following a similar approach to 2014's annexation of Crimea, organising what are widely described by observers as sham referenda. According to US National Security Council spokesman John Kirby, Russia is installing pro-Russian officials to run the occupied regions, and these imposed administrations will then seek to give the appearance of a vote to be won by acclaim, of course, on becoming a part of Russia. Will they get away with it? Open question. According to the head of MI6, the Russian military is getting close to running out of steam in its assault right now, at which point it will need to pause, giving Ukraine the opportunity for a counterattack. Russia has claimed that it's destroyed 4 of the US-supplied long-range HIMARS rocket systems, which, if true, hasn't been independently verified at this point, would show that, well, it hasn't run out of steam just yet. There is a good series of columns that the New York Times has been running, not a sentence I've ever used before, where high-profile columnists do a piece on "I was wrong about X." I read one this week which was Bret Stephens saying I was wrong about Trump voters, owning up to the fact, obvious to those of us who weren't in the ideological bubble, but not remotely so to those that were, that telling people how stupid they are is both likely to be wrong and also not the way you win them over to your side. Ironically, there was the usual Twitter backlash amongst progressive against that column, just to remind us that the Civil War mindset does not gladly tolerate empathy across the battle lines. But I like the idea of owning up to things that you got wrong and seeking to draw the lessons from it. There will always be some idiots who will say, if you were wrong about this, why should we trust you about, well, anything? The answer to that, of course, is that everyone is wrong. Sometimes it's the people who never ever admit it, who are the ones that probably you shouldn't trust, because they just double down on their mistakes to save their face. I mean, it does depend on the mistake, but generally people, at least those outside of politics, don't lose anything by owning up to imperfections. And the point is, you can learn more from mistakes than you can from things that go well. Learn from your own mistakes for sure, but if you can learn from someone else's without having to make them yourself, well, even better. Indeed, I used to be part of a network of European organisations that promoted corporate responsibility, and at our regular quarterly meetings, I tried to instigate what I called the cock-up club, where one of us would take it in turns to talk about a mistake that we'd made and what we had learned from it. It only worked for a short time because mostly people were not prepared to talk openly about their mistakes. It takes a degree of self-confidence. It's the exception rather than the norm. And in a world where people can get cancelled for a bad joke and sacked for all sorts of first-time mistakes, I get it. But people who are always watching their back take zero risks. And sometimes business, politics, life in general rewards a degree of measured risk-taking. Indeed, there are some companies that take that so much to heart, they actually celebrate failures to encourage people to share them. You don't need to go that far, of course. All right, now it would be a grievous failure if I were to neglect to thank the good people who support this channel on Patreon. As you know, I would not be able to take the time that I do to produce these videos without that support. And I would certainly not be able to focus the topics of these videos on whatever seems to be the most important issue to talk about, regardless of how skittish YouTube is feeling about it, whether it will demonetize those videos, whether it might do something more. The watchword on this channel is that I'm interested in the issues of the moment. I'm fascinated by the grey areas and the difficult dilemmas, which tend to be those issues that the tech giants are most careful of. So to have the confidence behind me to be able to talk about those really requires knowing that you have got my back. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.